Travel back in time with a trip inside the Iowa's News Now vault.
In 1961, President Kennedy pledged before the decade was out, the United States would put a man on the moon and safely bring him home. It would be the greatest peacetime undertaking in history.
Initially, when I started on the program, I think as might be typical of engineers, I was a bit skeptical that we could bring it off.
Harold Oates was a Collins radio design engineer on the Apollo program from 1962 through 1969.
When things got a little drab and we were having particular problems, just keeping sight of that goal was sufficient motivation to keep us pushing on.
Oates was one of more than 500 Collins radio employees working on the Apollo program. Collins was responsible for all of the electronics that had to do with the communication and data systems in the command module. Jim Westcott was a Collins program administrator for the Apollo program.
When the television came down from the capsule, it was over our equipment, and when the heartbeats came down, it was over our equipment. We had it all.
It was in this complex in the mid-1960s that Collins engineers and employees designed, built, and tested the communication systems used in the Apollo project. Part of the delicate precision production work done for the voice communication systems of the Apollo program was done by Bersha Brown, a Collins employee for 45 years.
Every solder connection was looked at through a microscope. And when you move a microscope up to 30 power and look at a solder connection, boy, you see all kinds of things wrong with that solder connection. So they had to be perfect and pass that before they go out the door.
From Bersha's workbench to the top design engineer, Collins' contributions to the Apollo program went off without a hitch.
Collins never had a failure. Never had a failure.
It was always successful.
Everything worked all the time. We had on all of the missions. We sort of shined our fingernails after that one.
To those people, tonight we give a special thank you.
When astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin paid thanks to the more than 250,000 Americans who made landing a man on the moon possible, they did so over Collins radio equipment, designed, built, and tested in Cedar Rapids. 500 Collins employees worked on the Apollo program in the 1960s.
There was a real spirit. There was just anything that you wanted in the company you got, because everybody, I don't care what they worked on, wanted Apollo to succeed. They didn't want us to be known as the troop that didn't make it.
Collins communication systems worked to perfection on every flight, and while the country heard and saw the Apollo astronauts clearly, what they didn't see were the long hours and the stress and strain put on Collins employees, like Bersha Brown.
It was very nerve-wracking when you realized that somebody's life was really depending on you.
Brown was a production line worker who recalled meeting one of the astronauts who often toured the Collins facilities during the Apollo program.
He said, the engineers know how to design these units. We know how to fly them. Do you know how to build them? And that stuck with me. Did I know how to build them?
While the astronauts' words inspired Brown to continue her flawless work, they scared off other production workers. Brown said the thought of being responsible for an astronaut's life caused some Collins employees to transfer departments or even quit. The scope of the Apollo program was also felt upstairs by the design engineers.
The specifications were very stringent and very exacting, and there was little room for compromise. We just had to meet the specifications, and sometimes it took extra effort, long hours.
But Oates and Brown and all of the Collins employees would see the fruits of their labor when Armstrong set foot on the moon.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
To see this thing all come about that night was almost beyond description. It just made the hair on the back of your neck stand up.
Yes, I worked on the lunar module for Grumman Aircraft.
Olwine native Bob Kapmeyer is a design engineer who helped develop the Lunar Excursion Modular. It's the portion of the spacecraft that took the astronauts from the Apollo command module to the moon's surface and back. Kapmeyer's expertise centered on the explosive devices that held the ascent and descent stages of the LEM together.
It varied anywhere from about 42 on up to about 50 explosive devices. These devices were on the nuts and bolts. Most of the explosives were exploded just at the time of launch, or just prior to the launch, of the start of the engine.
Kampmeyer's explosives in the LEM worked flawlessly throughout the Apollo program. One of his LEM manuals and other Apollo memorabilia are on display at the Lynn County Historical Museum. They're part of the museum's focus this month on man's exploration of space. One of the items that certainly catches your eye when you come into the museum are Iowa's own moon rocks on loan from the governor's office in Des Moines.
They are tiny fragments of the moon's crust that were brought back and given to the state, along with a tiny Iowa state flag that was taken to the moon and brought back.
The museum's display also includes newspaper accounts of man's first landing on the moon and a tribute to Arthur Collins and his company's contribution to the space effort. Cedar Rapids physician Albert Coates' involvement with the Apollo program is also documented at the museum. Coates' favorite story involves this prescription note, still sealed in its original plastic cover. It came from the USS Guadalcanal, the recovery ship for Apollo 9. The prescription request was from the NASA doctor quarantined with the 3 astronauts on board after they were picked up at mission's end. It was delivered to Coates, who was the ship's flight surgeon.
Received this handwritten prescription from Dr. Carpentier requesting spirits fermente, which obviously is a little liquid nourishment to help recover from the flight.
Contact light. Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
6.5 hours after landing on the moon, the hatch to the lunar lander opened and Neil Armstrong made his way down the ladder. Here on Earth, as an 11-year-old, I remember watching with my family in Cedar Rapids the black and white TV pictures from the moon with utter amazement and getting goosebumps as the historic moment was about to occur. 9:56 Iowa time, a record 500 million people around the world would see Neil Armstrong become the first man to step on the moon.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
It was one of the most exciting things I think I've ever seen on television.
What was the emotion at the Collins house?
Well, elation, very much happiness. And Arthur always wondered and worried until it was over.
I remember with great joy the accomplishment because, quite frankly, in my own heart, I was very fearful that it would not be successful. And I suppose if the one thought I had in mind, as I recall, is suppose something went wrong, they couldn't get off the moon.
To some, it was too much to believe. Dr. Louis Frank is an astronomy professor at the University of Iowa. He was involved with NASA in the 1960s and recalls a conversation he had with a Washington, D.C. cab driver shortly after the historic landing on the moon.
He looked at me and he said, boy, they must have had a good studio to do that landing in. He said, I can't believe that they put anybody on the moon. And we got in this long argument about that it was real, you know.
Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin would spend only 21 hours and 36 minutes on the moon, but it provided a lifetime of memories for the nearly 250,000 Americans who spent close to a decade achieving the goals set forth by President Kennedy in 1961.
I felt tremendous pride and even a lump in the throat that we as a nation had accomplished this, and I was a part of it.
20 feet, 10 feet, 5 feet.
When the space shuttle returns to Earth, its ability to land successfully rides upon Rockwell Collins equipment designed and built in Cedar Rapids. Collins has 3 separate instruments on board: the TACAN, the horizontal situation indicator, and the display driver unit, all key components in the shuttle landing safely.
The people who work here take it very seriously and are kind of excited about the fact that we're involved with the space program.
Collins' contribution to the shuttle could be expanding as NASA looks to update the technology on its bus to space.
NASA has a very strong high priority initiative, hopefully to come to fruition in the next year or two, to completely upgrade the entire cockpit to the newest and latest electronic displays that Collins is in the forefront of providing for commercial aviation.
While the future looks bright with the shuttle at Rockwell Collins, it's also an exciting time for the University of Iowa and Professors Louis Frank and Donald Gurnett. The astronomy experts have designed and constructed research instruments that are about to open new doors about the planets Neptune and Jupiter.
To see the pictures coming in from these spacecraft because you're seeing worlds that have never been seen before. When we fly by the planet, we get these just terrific pictures with all kinds of details, and We've seen some very bizarre objects out there, things that we just never guessed would have existed.
One of the instruments built in the labs at Iowa is aboard Voyager 2, the probe that will fly by Neptune next month. The other will be placed on Galileo, an exploration mission that will hopefully be launched aboard the shuttle in October. Its goal is to become the first orbiter of Jupiter.
We have an instrument on to look at plasmas, or very hot gases around Jupiter that are so hot they're sort of torn apart, and we built an instrument to in fact detect these hot gases in the vicinity of Jupiter.